glad to be here with you this morning and to be able to talk as part of the mental health series that you have going on in campus. And before we begin, I want to start off by reading a verse from Jeremiah, chapter 17, verses 7 through 8. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. It shall not fear when heat comes, and leaves shall stay green. In the year of drought, it is not anxious, and it does not cease to bear fruit. This morning, I'm going to be sharing about my own struggles that I've encountered, in particular around health and as a cancer survivor and as a Hurricane Katrina survivor. In fact, I'll never forget, my family and I, we had moved to South Mississippi just 6 days before Hurricane Katrina hit. And that particular morning, I remember the pastor at this large Southern Baptist church that we were attending that morning slowly sauntered up toward the podium, leaned in that morning, and he said, "If you remember Camille, you know what I'm about ready to say." And my wife turns to me in the pew and she says, "Honey, who's Camille?" And I paused for a moment and jokingly said, "Well, she must be in the Old Testament." Well, I quickly learned that Camille was not in the Old Testament, but in fact had been one of the worst natural disasters to hit the United States about 30 years prior. And right after the service was over, my wife and I turned to each other and we were trying to figure out, do we stay, do we evacuate? Is this something that we should take seriously? Is this something we should be scared of? Are we worried? What do we do? And I remember turning to the person behind us in the pew and explaining that we just moved down south from upstate in Illinois, and we weren't sure what to happen. And she said, "Oh, bless your heart," which, by the way, I learned is not a compliment. It took me a little while to learn that. But she said, "Bless your heart." She's like, "Don't worry about it. At worst, it's going to be like camping for a couple of days." Well, my wife and I ended up, because we didn't have internet where we lived yet, because we had just moved in. Cable person was supposed to come in on Monday. We didn't have cell phone signal yet, because we had moved from the Chicago area. And by the way, afterwards, if you want to know the carrier who I could not get a signal with, I'm glad to tell you after service. And we didn't know anyone. And so that was the first that we were hearing, that the storm had shifted over the weekend. It was supposed to be hitting over in Louisiana, but now it was going between Louisiana and Mississippi right toward our own community. So after church, my wife and I, and at the time we only had one daughter, Colleen, and we went back to my office where I had internet. And maybe you've seen these famous images from the NOAA service, these black and white images of Hurricane Katrina. And I remember sitting there, my wife sitting beside me, my young daughter on my lap, and seeing the screen completely filled with the images of Hurricane Katrina coming. And so we decided to evacuate. And in that moment, I felt incredibly, incredibly helpless. I didn't know what to do or how to move forward. Fast forward several years now, this time instead of a church, it's the cancer center. And instead of the pastor slowly coming into the room, it's the oncologist briskly walking to his desk, pulls up his computer screen, reviews the tests that I've had, and shares with me, "Jamie, it's cancer. And it's late-stage cancer. It looks like the cancer has spread from your colon to also creating now a mass in your pelvis. We caught it late." And he goes on to share with me that I've just been diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer at the age of 35. And as I hear that news and it starts to wash over me, I start to kind of zone out. And he was talking, and it seemed almost like an episode of the old Charlie Brown cartoons where I know he's talking, but all I'm hearing is this muffled voice. And I can't hear anything else he says as I begin to cry. And as I begin to shake, I think he realizes that I'm not hearing him, so he tries to engage me in some small talk. And he says, "Jamie, what is it that you do for a living?" And I share with him that, well, I'm a professor, and I also direct a disaster institute. And he pauses and with his best bedside manner says to me, "I think you're in for your own personal disaster." And he was right. That over the next year, I would go through chemo and radiation that first summer. In fact, I took oral chemotherapy twice a day and had radiation 5 days a week for the entire summer. And just as I started to recover from those treatments, I ended up having to have a major surgery that was like having 4 at one time to remove the cancer and to remove the tumor that they had found as well. And then just as I thought I was finally over the worst of it, now getting about 4 or 5 months in at this point, I remember having the doctor tell me, we think, Jamie, because you were so young, that now you need to have drip chemotherapy, and we need to do this for 6 months, which meant I would actually be hooked up to a machine and have to sit there for about 4 hours to 6 hours at the hospital. And then from there, they would hook it up to me where I would have to go home and continue to receive chemotherapy for another 36 hours continuously. Many moments during that recovery process, I remember thinking to myself, this must be what death feels like. But I tell you, the pain, the physical pain, that wasn't the worst of it. It was the emotional struggle that was the hardest part for me. I had moments when I wondered, why was this happening to me? I'm not going to get to watch my 3 young little redheads eventually maybe walk down the aisle in marriage. I may not get to see them graduate college. I may not be able to grow old with my wife and buy that hot rod truck that I've always wanted to take the teardrop camper to go camping with, which, by the way, I don't really care about camping or the teardrop. I just want a reason so I can buy that hot rod truck. But that was my goal for retirement. Now that's gone too. Why am I not going to get to grow old with my wife? And there was one morning in particular, I was dropping off my youngest daughter, who at the time was only about 4 years old. And as I dropped her off at preschool and I started to walk away, suddenly it hit me of something I'd learned right when I was in your seats in undergrad in a developmental psychology course about how sometimes our very earliest memories aren't always our own, but are the stories that others have told us. And in that moment, I realized that if I don't make it, my daughter's only memories may not actually be her memories of me, but the stories of others. And I remember rushing into the bathroom and just collapsing in tears. I've spent the last 13 years researching disasters and humanitarian crises around the globe, studying about how to cultivate faith and resilience in the time of disasters. But going through cancer taught me these lessons in a whole new way. And today that's what I want to spend my time on sharing with you about, is how you can begin to cultivate faith and resilience in times of struggle, whether it's physical or emotional or spiritual. One of the first things that is important for us to do in times of facing our own personal disasters is to begin to make meaning of those events. One of the things that we've seen in our research is that individuals who have higher levels of spiritual meaning making, it helps to buffer against trauma symptoms, almost like a roller coaster, that the more meaning we can make, the quicker that trauma goes down. So it helps us to make sense of what we're going through. Because when a personal disaster like a diagnosis or the loss of a loved one happens in our lives, or maybe it's an abuse that has occurred, or it's the loss of someone important to us, that when those things happen, it causes us to ask why questions. Some theorists say that one of the reasons we do this is because most of us, on some level, if we realize it or not, engage in just world thinking. The idea that good things happen to good people. So we may ask ourselves, like, why, God? Why is this happening? I don't understand. Those why questions really baffled me, and I struggled and carried them for a long time about, God, why would you let this happen to me? Why don't I get to be with my family? Why is this happening when I've dedicated my life to trying to help others? Why? I mean, after all, I recycle. I'm a good person, God. Why is this happening to me? But one of the things that I realized is that God doesn't in Scripture promise us the answers to our why questions. But He does promise us something even better. He promises Himself. After Superstorm Sandy hit the East Coast a few years back, one of my colleagues was there and was working with a relief organization to help with rebuilding. And as they entered this particular community that had been heavily hit, they came across this house that was largely standing on the outside, but the roof was completely gone. And as they walked up to the home to meet the homeowner, they expected to find this individual in shambles. But instead, when they greeted and he welcomed them into his home, he paused for a moment and said, sometimes you have to lose the roof to see the stars. That's someone who understood the importance of making meaning out of trauma. But meaning doesn't always happen easily. It's messy. It's hard. My why questions, like I said, kept with me. I started wondering, God, was it something that I did to deserve this? Was it because when I was in high school, I was on this acne medicine that I found out years later got pulled because people in their 30s were getting colon cancer? Was it the medicine? Was it because I wanted to get rid of my acne? Seriously? God, I've got cancer because of zits? Is that what this is about? Or maybe that's not it. Maybe it was because I grew up on a farm in the middle of cornfields, drinking well water that had likely been filled with pesticides. Yet I look around at my family, my friends that live 2 cornfields away, drinking the same sort of well water. None of them have cancer. Why do I have cancer? Never did I find the answer I was looking for. But as I shared, I found what I was needing in the presence of God. Augustine actually talks about that sweetness of sorrow, of being in God's presence. So if you're struggling to find meaning, keep pushing forward, because one of the things we know also from our research with cancer survivors is that as people engage in their struggle, that is where some of that meaning comes from. Another important part to cultivating faith and resilience when we're facing our challenges in life comes through accepting and welcoming spiritual, social support. But one of the things that I've experienced and I've seen firsthand with others, that when we're facing difficulties, oftentimes when we need people the most is when we want them the least. That instead of letting others come and help and support us, which we know helps, we did a study in South Carolina after Hurricane Matthew wiped out so many communities there. And one of the things that we discovered were the individuals that had high levels of spiritual support from their families, their friends, their neighbors, from their churches, from faith-based organizations that came and walked alongside them. Those people, they had lower levels of PTSD or trauma symptoms. And on top of that, the views of God that they held on to were sustained, that they viewed God as more loving when others loved them. Yet my own cancer experience, fairly early on, my college president came to visit my home. I remember I had fallen asleep and my mother was visiting and came and woke me up, and I was in kind of a stumper from all the medicines. She's like, "Jamie, the president is here. Jamie, the president is here." And I'm like waking up, I'm like, "Obama? What? This can't be right. No. What is my mom trying to be funny?" We kind of have the same humor. So like, what is going on here? And then I walk down the stairs, I'm like, Dr. Riken makes a lot more sense. And so he's asking me how I'm doing and if he could pray for me. And I said, well, I think the part that I'm struggling with the most, the part that I could use the most prayers for, is accepting help from others. I'm really struggling letting others help me right now. Just days before that, I was walking through the kitchen and my wife was saying, "Honey, you can't drive to chemotherapy anymore. You're not physically well enough to do that. It's dangerous." And I'm saying, "I am just fine. I have no problems." And as I say that, I lose my balance, walk into the wall, and fall over. So she kind of won the argument. But I share that because it was hard for me to get over my pride, to allow others to help me. You see, a lot of my identity has been wrapped up in being a helper. I finally took a test on the Enneagram. How many of you have maybe done the Enneagram or heard of the Enneagram, right? Well, I took a test online, and it even told me just a few weeks ago that my primary strength is as a helper. Granted, the test also said, this is a free test, it's short, how accurate can it be? So maybe it wasn't the most accurate test, but I do know from my own experiences that I've always clung to that helper identity. I mean, that's what I do for a living. I help people not just in times of need, but in the worst times of need, in times of disasters or civil conflicts. So here I am trying to tell him that I'm struggling, and he pauses after a few moments and says, "Jamie, if we're honest with ourselves, we're all the type of people that are in need of help. In my community, I would not be here today cancer-free if it were not for my community. That they helped me go through that year of battling, that year of struggle with my cancer treatments. In fact, everybody pitched in. People were taking me to my chemotherapy treatments. People were taking me to radiation. People were bringing us food. People were praying for us. In our kitchen, over 4 of our doorways, we had over 200 cards sent from people in our community letting us know that they were thinking and praying for us. People mowed our lawn. People swept out the trash that accumulated. People went through and they cleared our driveways when it snowed. They took my kids for ice cream. They sat with me when I was in the cancer center getting chemotherapy as the poison filled my veins and I started to fall away into a slumber. My community walked with me through that process. And one of the things that they did was they actually had these little blue rubber bracelets. And in fact, I've got it in my backpack, the one that I had during that year. And they gave it to me and my family, these little bracelets, and then to others in our community as a sign of solidarity. And on it, it had my name, and it said, pray, and then it said, Lord, hear our prayers. Well, 6 years ago, some of the team from the Humanitarian Disaster Institute that I direct went to Kenya to the Kakuma refugee camp, and I wasn't able to go because of my health already. And when they showed up, several of my team members had the little blue bracelets. And some of the refugee pastors there were talking with them, and we were doing a training on trauma care for them. And somebody had asked about what are these blue bracelets that HCI team members are wearing. And so one of my colleagues explained that, well, we do this to remind us to pray and to support Jamie. It's a sign of community. And some of the pastors there asked, can we have one of those bracelets? Can we have these bracelets? My colleague, Jenny Wong, who's a managing director of the Institute, is over in Kenya right now. So she's actually boarding a plane in Nairobi today to start coming back. And 2 days ago, I got a text in the middle of the night, and I'm like, who's texting me at 3 a.m.? And I grab my phone, and I see pictures of a refugee pastor. And I'm like, why is she sending this to me at 3 a.m.? And then I notice on his left wrist is the blue bracelet that he received 6 years ago that has my name on it. It says, pray, Lord, hear our prayers for Jamie Aten. Again, I broke down and I was reminded of the importance that even on the other side of our traumas, we still need community. Another way that we can go about cultivating faith and resilience is by learning to forgive. Because sometimes when we're engaged and people are helping us, even though the helpers are so important, sometimes it can also cause harm or cause hurt to us. In fact, in the disaster community among emergency managers, they refer to volunteers as the second disaster sometimes. Or they oftentimes will send out messages about don't be an SUV, spontaneous, unaffiliated volunteer. The person that just kind of parachutes in to help and oftentimes is helping for the wrong reasons. So you're going to sometimes have people that are trying to help, they're going to mess up, they're going to upset you, they're going to offend you, they're going to do something wrong. I saw this after Hurricane Katrina. I remember it had been several months after the storm, and we were in this large coliseum along the coast over in the Gulfport area, and there were hundreds of people from the community. You had emergency managers, you had disaster relief folks there, public health, mental health, pastors, teachers, community leaders. We're all in this large room trying to figure out what are we going to do as a community to move forward. And there's all this talking happening, and people are having discussions around tables. It's filling this large coliseum room. And suddenly I notice that part of the room is starting to go silent. And I notice that the silence is following this woman wearing a blue shirt with and a blue jacket. And as she walks through the room, wherever she's at, the tables around her drop dead silent. And you can feel the tension. It's palpable in the air. I'm sitting across the room, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. Why are people reacting to her this way? And then she sits down, and I see what she has on the back of her jacket. In bright yellow letters, she has the F word. F-E-M-A. Now, wait a minute. We're in chapel. What did you think I was going to spell when I was talking about the four-letter F word? Come on now. Some people need to repent. Myself included. I'm the one that told the joke. But the reason why they got so upset was because they felt like FEMA had failed them, that they needed help, and they knew it, and the people that they were relying on, they felt like they failed. Well, FEMA actually goes on to repent. They apologize to the community. They own their mistake, and they start working with the community to move forward. And we need to do the same. Another example of this happened to me in my own personal time of crisis. It was not long after I had found out that I had been diagnosed with cancer, and my oncologist had ordered another scan to make sure that the cancer hadn't possibly spread elsewhere in my body. And as I'm getting ready to go in for this PET scan, I'm laying down on this cold kind of metal table, and it looks like the rest of the machine looks kind of like a giant white cave. And as I'm laying on the machine and starting to enter the cave, I hear a little voice from the machine that says, "And now hold your breath. Don't move." So by the way, if this whole disaster psychology thing doesn't work out for me, I want that job. I want a job doing medical care voiceovers. So if any of you have tips on that, have an in, let me know, because I want that job someday. But I totally ended up ignoring everything that the instructions had told me to do, because it was in that moment, right as I was supposed to be holding still, that it occurred to me, I have to go home and tell my 3 little girls that Daddy has cancer. I began to sob. I began to shake, tears running down, and then eventually turned to, that ugly, like, dry heave shake cry that happens. I was in so much agony about what I was going to have to face when telling my kids. And then out of nowhere, the machine stops, and suddenly, I feel a hand on my shoulder. It was the tech who was there working the machine. She didn't say a word. She just placed her hand on my shoulder as I cried and as I shook. Eventually, my tears started to dry, slowly stopped shaking. I tell you, that was a sacred moment. But then she decided to talk. And she goes on to say, Jamie, God only tests the strong. And if that wasn't like a home run of a thing to say, she follows it with, at least your cancer experience isn't going to be as bad as what my cancer experience was like. And in that moment, I was totally shocked. And I could have gotten angry, but then I thought, you know what? Now I have something to say. Anytime I give a speech or a talk or a training on trauma of what not to say in the aftermath of a trauma. So maybe I still have some forgiveness issues. The fact that I really do tell this story every time I talk about what not to say. But if we're going to move forward, we have to learn to forgive. We did a study in Liberia after the civil conflict had happened there in the long term, and we wanted to know what helped people live more resiliently in the face of this horrible genocide and trauma that had happened there. And one of the things that we found was that forgiveness helped people to engage their faith in a more rich way that helped them to have not only lower levels of trauma, but actually improve their physical health. And those that had higher levels of forgiveness also reported more growth in long-term aftermath of trauma. But sometimes we don't only need to forgive others, sometimes we need to also forgive ourselves. See, part of the story I've not shared with you is about the time I found out that I was in remission, 3 other people from my college were diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer as well. One of them being a dear friend. One of them being a dear friend of mine, Brett. We would often, the way we got to know each other was that we would hide out on different days of the week from campus at local coffee shops so we could write. And then we'd complain about how we never had time to write and how we always get interrupted from writing. And then we'd realize we spent an hour complaining about how we don't have time to write over coffee. But this would happen almost just all the time. That's how I got to know him. And actually, I found out that Brett had passed as I was going to Arizona to do a training on trauma. And I missed a play that one of his friends had written because he was a poet to put on a performance on campus, taking his words and turning them into a play. And I missed it because I was doing something I wanted to do. Fast forward a little while. My wife and I go with a couple of friends to a play that was happening on campus called The Sparrow. And it's about this young girl who early on in her life, there's a horrible accident that kills about 20 kids, but she's the only one that survives. I think it was a train accident. And she carries this guilt with her. And that's largely what that story is about. And as soon as that play was over, I realized that what I had just watched is what I had been experiencing and carrying with me. I was carrying survivor's guilt. And as soon as it was over, I went down to the director, who just happened to be my friend Brett's best friend, Mark, who was the one who had actually turned his poems into a play about a year prior. And I go up to Mark after it was over, and I said, Mark, I know you know who I am, and I know you know some of my story, but what I don't know that you know is that I am struggling. I thought for the last year I've been carrying anger around with me everywhere I went. But as I watched this play and I listened to the words that were expressed, I realized I've been carrying around survivor's guilt. He gives me a hug, and he's like, Jamie, Brett would want you to continue to live your story. So for those of you that struggle with that survivor's guilt, I would encourage you to continue to live out your story. Making comparisons is only going to make things more difficult. We went to Baton Rouge after the flood a couple years ago that had happened there, and one of the things that we heard a lot of survivors talking about was dry guilt. And what they were meaning by that is that their guilt was coming from the fact that I don't have water in my home, but my neighbor does. Some even talked about having minnow guilt, like a goldfish, like a tiny little fish, because they would say, well, how can I feel sad or depressed or angry or upset or anxious when I only had 3 feet of water in my house, but my neighbor in comparison had 6 feet of water? I want to tell you, those comparisons are only going to make your struggles worse. Another key way that we can start to have greater resilience over the struggles that we're engaging with is through spiritual surrender. Not long after Katrina, just about 3 months after that storm, my research team and I, we did a large study of people around the coast who had been drastically affected by Katrina. And one of the things that we found were the individuals that had engaged in spiritual surrender actually were more resilient and had a more positive view of God, and that they felt that God was actually more in control over their life and their disaster experience. But I tell you, I didn't like those findings. I thought maybe I had run the data wrong. Because to me, spiritual surrender just sounded like somebody throwing their hands up. In fact, when I heard the word spiritual surrender, it kind of conjured up to me the imagery of a bad country song. So I apologize to any of you Carrie Underwood fans in here, but all I could think about was it sounded like Jesus take the wheel, right? Like I'm just going to throw up my hands and not have an active role in it. After Katrina, I remember seeing a cartoon that a local artist had made that had shown someone who had passed away from the storm and was now up talking to St. Peter. And St. Peter was getting ready to greet them, and the person who had died in the cartoon said, "Why didn't you save me from the flooding that I went through?" And suddenly God interjects into this cartoon and says, well, when we told you to leave, you didn't leave. And then when you were flooded and on top of your house, I sent somebody by in a boat to save you. And then when you didn't get into the boat, I sent somebody in a helicopter to come to save you. But you kept saying that you were waiting for me to give you a sign. Those were your signs. And that's kind of the mental imagery I had of this idea of spiritual surrender, that I thought it was passive, that we were waiting for God to somehow just come in and take care of everything without us having to do anything. Kind of like a parent who maybe says, yes, my child is horribly ill and could die, but I'm going to refuse medical treatment, instead of joining with God and also getting them medical treatment. But then I had this experience where it was in the midst of my chemo, at the worst of it, and the chemotherapy actually caused me to have neuropathy in my feet and hands. So even like coming up here, I counted the stairs before I walked up, and I'm thinking, don't trip, because I have permanent nerve damage where I can't feel my feet. But at that point, I still had feeling, but it was horribly sensitive to cold. And it was in around February, and it's freezing outside in the Chicagoland, and I wade through the snow. I get all dressed up in my winter gear, and I was thankful that I had enough strength to at least pull the trash and recyclables to the curb. And as I eventually get to the curb, and I pause for a minute, I just noticed the cold wind that's blowing that just feels like little razors coming across my skin, especially my feet and the hands, from the sensitivity of the chemotherapy medicines had caused. And as I pause to catch my breath, my scarf falls off my face, and I inhale a cold winter breath. And because of the medicine, it felt like I was gargling ice. As I had been carrying those cans to the curb, I had been praying up to that point of, dear God, heal me. Dear God, take this cancer from me. Dear God, stop what is happening to me. Save my life. These were the things I was praying. But after I felt like I gargled ice, suddenly my thoughts changed. I started wondering, does God hear me? If he does hear me, can he answer my prayers? And as I got closer to the house, I asked, is there even a God? And then I remembered from research that those who pray when they're facing major health outcomes actually have a higher mortality odds in their favor. So regardless of what I was believing in the moment, I decided I'm going to keep praying. And so I continue engaging in prayer, and I go upstairs to my bedroom. I'm getting ready to lay down for a nap, but suddenly I drop to my knees. And I drop to my knees in prayer. And my prayer changes. It was no longer, God, heal me. It was no longer, God, take this from me. My prayer instead was, God, please take care of my wife and daughters if I don't make it. That was the hardest prayer that I've ever uttered in my life. I came to realize through that experience, though, the spiritual surrender is not passive. Recognizing what we can control and inviting God to help us with that which we can't, and giving it, our situation, to him. It's one of the most willful and actful deeds that we can do as Christians. So I want to end with this one final story. A number of years ago, I was doing work that helping to develop a trauma program for women who were survivors of gender-based violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, who just had gone through incredible atrocities. And through that experience, I learned of the plight of the people of Goma. This was a group of people that had been through civil conflict, through drought and famine and other types of challenges. And as it was safe enough for them to return, a volcano goes off and destroys their community, and they have to flee. But the people of Goma, they came back. And they took the lava rock that was left, that had destroyed their homes, and some of them actually used it to rebuild their homes with it. They used the lava rock to build fences. They used lava rock to help create their roads. They literally rebuilt their lives from the ashes. So I want you to know that God can redeem your disaster. I sometimes joke that having gone through cancer and all the scars that have marked up my body permanently, I sometimes joke that, well, those give me more street cred. But if I'm honest with you, I'm actually quite self-conscious about all the scarring, the railroad tracks up my abdomen, scars on my chest, on my sides. Self-conscious of the way it's changed my body. There was one day shortly after I finally was able to return to work, I was getting dressed and put my shirt on, and I was getting ready to start buttoning it. And all of a sudden, I noticed my youngest daughter, Carly, standing behind me, seeing me in the mirror, watching me. She's taking in the scars with her eyes. I can see her surveying the railroad track scar that goes up and down my body. And I don't know what to say. I just froze. And this tiny little voice, my sweet little Carly, asked, Daddy, when you get to heaven, are you still going to be in pain? Are you still going to hurt? I turn around and I bend down to my sweet little girl and I say, Carly, God promises us that someday he'll give us a new body, that there will be no more pain, there will be no more sorrow. Daddy won't hurt anymore. And suddenly, I see this little smile start in the corner of her mouth, and it grows into this giant grin. And then just like a WNBA player that just won the game with the last second shot, she lets out a yes and skips off. So if you take nothing else from our time together this morning, I want it to be this. Know that God can redeem your disaster no matter how big, no matter how challenging it is, whether it's in this life or the next. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you so much for everything that you've done. Thank you for being with us and not leaving us to suffer alone, but that you walk with us, that you hold us, that you carry us, that you drag us through our pain, and that you help to redeem our suffering. We just thank you so much for everything you've done. And if everyone here this morning, if you could help me end this prayer instead of an amen, could you help me end it in a Carly-sized yes? 1, 2, 3. Yes! Go in peace.